Welcome, Pacific greetings. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this webinar that reflects on the state of the ocean, the world of our ocean governance, and how it impacts our part of the region. Tonight, we'll be discussing, or this evening, we'll be discussing key development issues in relation to ocean governance that took place this year, 2025, highlighting their significance and their implications. As many of you know, 2025 has been a pivotal year for oceans, marked by the UN High Seas Treaty coming into force, the third UN Oceans Conference, which was held in June this year in Nice, France, and we'll be exploring what they mean for us, particularly for us in the Pacific. I'm Joey Tao, the coordinator of the Pacific Network on Globalization, a regional watchdog that advocates for Pacific people's rights on social and economic justice issues in our region. But before we dive in, I just wanted to acknowledge some of our incredible partners who making this webinar of, you know, contributing to this conversation, and to acknowledge our partner from the Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, Dawn. We welcome Maureen Panjueli, who is no stranger to this space. And also joining us from Aotearoa, New Zealand, we welcome Naima from the Ocean Vision Legal. And joining us all the way in the UK, we thank our colleague Olive from the High Seas Alliance, who is joining us early in the morning in the UK. Welcome, Olive. My colleagues, my co-work colleagues, India, who is our climate justice campaigner, also joining us from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Adam Wolfelden, who is the deputy coordinator of PANG and oversees our oceans and trade program. Just wanted to welcome our panelists. And we've never tried this before, but we're this way of co-moderating. So this webinar this evening would be very conversational. It will be amongst panelists, and we will be co-moderating these sessions. So welcome to my fellow panelists, but also the co-moderators. But before we dive deep into the conversations this evening, I just wanted to provide some context as we reflect on the state of our ocean. As I mentioned earlier, we witnessed the UN High Seas Treaty, also known as BBNJ, achieving its 60 ratifications to enter into force. This is a large achievement for ocean protection and marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. Like I said, we had the UN Oceans Conference, and I think this really was an opportunity for the global community to reflect, but also review the commitments on SDG 14 this year. While this is some big milestones that the global community did for oceans or convened on oceans, there are other significant, some developments. Of course, the International Seabed Authority in Kingston, Jamaica, continues to convene. This year saw the 30th session of the Council and Assembly to convene around a mining code. The WTO also convened on fisheries subsidies, and there are ongoing discussions to decarbonize maritime transport at the IMO. But colleagues, there are also some emerging issues. The Blue Economy and Finance Forum that also took place within the timeframes of the UN Oceans Conference this year brought not only state parties, but investors who are, or industry who are working around ocean and ocean finances. Whilst this is happening, marine pollution continues to be a big issue, not only for us here in the Pacific, but globally. This year, the highest amount of plastic and waste in the ocean was recorded at an estimate 75 to 199 million tons this year. And of course, the crucial climate and ocean science. There are advancements, conversations happening around this that bridges the ocean climate nexus. So just these reflections provide us or give us some of these advancements have been in ocean governance and ocean policy spaces, but also provides us some challenges. How the global community is determining the future of our oceans. So I hope that provides a perfect segue, or rather, a perfect overview of how this conversation will turn out tonight, or this dialogue. What are some of the things we'd like to discuss? So we'll jump straight into it. I'll introduce our first speaker, Naima, who have said from the Ocean Vision Legal, who are a partner in the region, and who have been working closely not only with Peng, but other institutions within the region on the issue of Fukushima. I think the ongoing developments in Fukushima is very important for this part of the region, given that we continuously faced with the legacy issues around testing that happen in the Pacific. So I'll hand it over to Naima to provide us an overview of what were some of the key things that happened uh, with Fukushima this year, uh, and what can we expect in the coming months. Over to you, Naima. Welcome.
Binaka, Joey, and Talafakoto, lovely to be here with you all. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share. And thank you, Joey, for your question. You know, I do want to quickly highlight the exceptionally strong Pacific presence at UNOC this year, because that is a reassuring indication that Pacific voices are being heard at the global level, and that leadership is coming from those most directly affected. So to me, that felt very powerful as someone who thinks about how translatable or how tangible outcomes and efforts in the international fora are for civil society and community. Um, and then on the topic of ocean health and human rights, I guess by way of context, since August 2023, Japan has conducted 14 discharges, releasing portions of over 1.3 million metric tons of advanced liquid processing system, or ALPS, treated water into the Pacific Ocean. And this is a process planned to continue for about 30 years. So that reveals kind of the magnitude of the risk and the pollution. And so the Japanese government asserts that the releases meet internationally safe standards, and that monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, lots of acronyms here, shows no measurable impact beyond Japan's coastal waters. However, in March of this year, 6 UN special rapporteurs issued a joint communication warning that the ALPS, or the Advanced Liquid Processing System, cannot remove all radioactive contaminants, including substances capable of bioaccumulating in marine organisms, so consumed by fish and then consumed by humans. So they cautioned that this may pose grave risks to human rights, particularly the rights to life, health, food, and culture, not only in Japan, but across the Pacific. And I should add that this response came after Ocean Vision Legal, on Pang's behalf, and alongside more than 50 Pacific civil society organizations, including Dawn, submitted evidence of human rights violations related to this release. And so the special rapporteurs expressed utmost concern about the inability of the ALPS system to remove all radionuclides. And they noted that the treating plant, the plant's own data confirms that the treated water still contains multiple radioactive substances, including high levels of tritium, and warned that Japan's chosen solution may actually entail grave risks to the enjoyment of human rights of populations within and beyond its borders. So we know, of course, that this is not just an environmental issue, it's a legal and a moral one. Because by discharging these radioactive contaminants into the Pacific, Japan risks breaching its obligations under international law, including the ICCPR, the CRC, UNCLOS, and others that are mentioned in the communication from the special rapporteurs. And these international laws require states to prevent foreseeable harm, to avoid transboundary pollution, and to consult affected communities. And ultimately, these releases threaten the rights, as I've said, to life, health, food, and the cultural survival of Pacific peoples. And they directly undermine intergenerational equity. So now I think, ultimately governments have a responsibility to act. And in line with the UN experts' communication, the international community should press Japan to halt further discharges, to adopt precautionary measures, and to pursue safer and long-term storage options. And for our Pacific peoples whose social, economic, and cultural well-being is bound to the ocean, these discharges reopen historic wounds. This is a deeply personal issue as well as a political one. And so the region still bears the legacy, of course, of nuclear testing, and communities continue to live with intergenerational radiation impacts. So Japan's unilateral decision, taken without regional consent, underscores deeper issues of justice and participation and transboundary accountability. So this communication should be seen as a positive step in the right direction, but the work simply can't stop there.
Maybe I'll jump in here to talk a bit about what's happened with trade, and particularly the World Trade Organization. And I think sort of picking up that point around, those responsible for the harm need to be responsible for addressing it. And that is a core tenet of so many environmental and sustainability treaties. Yet for when the World Trade Organization's fisheries subsidies agreement came into effect this year, in September, that principle of common and differentiated responsibility was completely absent. And so the treaty, was the agreement was given a mandate from the SDGs. Was said, let's prohibit subsidies to illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. Let's reduce certain subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity. And what they basically agreed upon and has now come into effect is half an agreement, and half an agreement that doesn't seem to really meet that mandate itself. And so, pulling on this thread around common and differentiated responsibility, the prohibitions around subsidies for IUU fishing, there's no distinction between a small scale fisher who's is fishing in a way that is unreported or even in some ways unregulated, and they're doing this for the livelihood, they're doing it as traditional practice. There's no distinction between those fishers and those large scale fishers who are breaching exclusive economic zones or fishing without permits, fishing illegally. And what that results in is an agreement that says we're going to treat everyone the same, regardless of what your responsibility is to this problem. And there are some little flexibilities in there, but ultimately the concern that a lot of us working on and looking at this agreement had was that inability to rein in these big fleets, these big industrial vessels that are doing a lot of the damage. And you can see that with a lot of the two main global organizations of fisherfolk put out a very strong statement around this agreement when it came into force. And so, you know, we have this agreement that's not really reining in the problem. What we're seeing, though, is that it's still being utilized as a sort of form of leverage. And there's a lot of pressure on governments who are members of the World Trade Organization. Currently, there's only 6 Pacific Island countries who are members. And of those 6, only Tonga and Fiji have ratified this agreement. And so they're the only 2 that are bound by it. And what that says, I think, is that there's a lack of interest in this agreement until it deals with this bigger problem around subsidies for overfishing and overcapacity, which, you know, this is part of these ongoing negotiations that are happening within the WTO to try and resolve this issue. But based on the previous text and what's being negotiated, the proposals aren't aimed to do that. They're fighting over how to exclude small-scale fishers without really taking the steps that are needed to rein in those countries and those fleets that have that historical responsibility. And so the inability of the WTO to really enact that that common but differentiated responsibility principle, but not only undermines it as a body that is supposed to deal with this issue of sustainability, it weakens other international agreements on sustainability. And you know, but given the fanfare, there's a lot of fanfare, there's a lot of you know, congratulatory messages, but there's an underlying pressure to this. And we saw that with the way that the US and Indonesia, when they were negotiating and coming up with some deal to, you know, for Indonesia to save itself from whatever Trump's tariffs were, within that deal was the requirement that Indonesia would ratify this agreement. And, you know, there's a whole bunch of issues around sovereignty there, but, you know, what we're seeing is that is now becoming part of this norm within global negotiations. And the link is just the recent discussions in the International Maritime Organization around this, you know, carbon price for shipping, where basically the US and mostly the US was threatening countries to say, if you vote in favor of this carbon price, we will retaliate. And you know, so we're having this breakdown in global discussions, how power is being exercised in these spaces. And you know, the WTO is notorious for being a terrible space for power politics, but we're seeing that just there's not even the diplomacy around it now, and we're entering a stage where the ability to act and take care of the oceans is starting to be undermined even further by this. And maybe I'll sort of park it there because there's a lot of other challenges, but maybe I can pass on to Olive to talk a bit more about one of the other major oceans treaty that came into force this year, which is, well, it's about to come into force, is the UN agreement around biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So thank you, and I'll pass it to you, Olive.
Thank you, Adam. What really stands out in 2025 for the Pacific Ocean, particularly in my area of work, is the BD&J agreement, as this is the point where global ambition is being tested against practical realities. So as you've seen, the BD&J agreement is a landmark agreement for ocean governance, recognizing the high seas, which make up nearly 2/3 of the ocean, and it needs collective stewardship beyond national borders. But in 2025, the focus is shifting from ratification to the implementation, and that's where the real impact on the Pacific begins. So for our region, this year, it's been about ensuring that Pacific priorities are visible and heard as states prepare for the first BD&J COP. And that includes advocating for equitable participation and for the inclusion of Indigenous and local knowledge systems, and also for the recognition of our cultural relationships with the ocean. Also, I'd like to highlight what's also striking is that in the same ocean spaces, like we're seeing like the overlap in the regimes, like for instance, the same ocean spaces affected by high seas biodiversity decisions are also under pressure from climate change, overfishing, and deep sea mining interests. So the Pacific is having to navigate these overlapping regimes at once. And we're doing it with limited resources, but with a strong collective voice. So what's important to highlight here is like the Pacific is standing at the center of that conversation, but reminding the world that governments must be relational and that caring for the ocean means caring for people too. On the health that Joey touched upon, I think our collective focus must be on BBNJ, Pacific-led BBNJ implementation, not just being participants in the process, but actually shaping it. So that's why I've highlighted the first BBNJ COP will be crucial. So like we need to ensure that there are strong institutional structures, for instance, like the scientific and technical body that include Pacific representation and perspectives from the outset. So it's implementation that must go beyond the legal text. It also like must reflect our ways of knowing and our relationships and our responsibilities to the ocean. So I've just highlighted like 3 key priorities that I wanted to highlight for 2026. So it's capacity and capability, equity and inclusion, and also connection and coherence. So if we focus on these 3 priorities, it's a chance for us to get it right and set the tone for a decade of ocean recovery, rooted in our like respect, reciprocity, and partnership values that the Pacific has always carried. So I think I can elaborate more later, but for now I'll park it here and hand it over to India, who will be speaking on blue carbon.
Kia ora, Olive. Kia ora koutou, everyone. Thank you for joining us and getting this speed tour of all these ocean issues and how they've been tracking over 2025. It's for me, you know, I'm the climate justice campaigner at PANG, so you know, there's lots of things I could be talking about when it comes to climate. I think where I really want to start this conversation is that in the last few weeks, scientists confirmed that we have overshot the 1.5 degree of warming target that we're meant to keep warming to. So we are in deeply unstable territory now when it comes to weather stability, and with that livelihoods and well-being and the very existence of some of our communities and cultures in the Pacific. And so I don't want to get too doom and gloom, but also like this is serious. And so we have to respond seriously as well. And so you know, there's lots of stuff happening in the climate space, but what I did want to focus on is an emerging trend. A lot of my work has been looking at kind of the shadow sides of climate and climate finance and the emerging trends, particularly when it comes to agendas coming from outside of the region into the Pacific to try and structure financial systems in a way that continues to benefit the global north. And as was mentioned earlier by both Naima and Adam, you know, those who have caused the harm should have to address it and should have to deal with it. And it's what we're starting to see in some of these conversations around nature-based solutions and nature commodities is a way of padding out those obligations or avoiding those obligations on the behalf of global north. And I want to pick up on some things that we saw coming out of the World Bank Land Conference in May of this year, which translates really well to some of these conversations around marine carbon and blue carbon. And the conversations at the World Bank Land Conference were really pushing for an interpretation of mining as having the potential to be net positive, right? So if you protect 2 square kilometers of forest, that you dig 1 square kilometer for a mine, then suddenly that makes your mining net positive. But that doesn't actually disappear the mine. And that's the same as happens for carbon markets and some of our debt for nature swaps, is that it's arguing for a net positive fossil fuel extraction. It doesn't actually make that fossil fuel extraction go away. And actually, in April this year, we released a report projecting and focusing on carbon markets. What we really found from that is the science is entirely dodgy on carbon markets, and the equation approach to protecting nature really doesn't come through. But it also sets up our communities who have carbon projects and are depending on income for that for a really unstable income source, because it's a market-based approach and markets change and fluctuate. And if we're meant to eventually reduce our emissions to near zero, then that income source also disappears. And so what we're starting to see, and we saw it in the coming Montreal biodiversity agreement, we saw it in elements of the BBNJ, we've seen it in conversations coming out of the climate negotiations and the new finance goal, that there's this push for a private market expansion of carbon markets, and that means also including our marine ecosystems. And our lovely partners at the World Forum of Fisherfolk have already come out and said this will have a massive negative impact on Indigenous land tenure and Indigenous ocean tenure. It already has a proven record on that, but particularly at the World Bank Land Conference and in those spaces, there's an aspiration to formalize land tenure, and that means converting to a private property tenure system. And so that means ultimately the potential displacement of fisherfolk, including some people who fish for subsistence practices. It also could impact incomes. It also just completely alters the relationship that we have with the ocean. They're so deeply grounded in thousands of years of culture, and having relationships and governance approaches to that shouldn't be altered by things like the imposition of carbon markets. We also see the interest of Pacific Island governments in opening up carbon trading, and that's just a new emerging policy space at the moment. I'll talk more about that in the next section. But we're also seeing countries like Germany and Australia give advice and provide technical support to create these carbon market policies. And so we have these wealthier countries who really have to just stop digging up fossil fuels and stop burning fossil fuels disproportionately, who are seeking to make their fossil fuel burning somehow net positive, even though it doesn't really work. And that's having many ripple effects across climate policy and climate finance approaches as well. But I'll just drop that there. And I will actually hand it over to Joey to talk about deep sea mining, another false promise frontier. Take it away, Joey.
Thanks, India. And I think, DSM really, the emergence of the blue carbon industry follows a similar path that deep sea mining has taken. One, internationally, had recognized the 30th session this year in June, where both the Assembly and Council, and this is two important organs of the International Seabed Authority that informs or rather oversees UNCLOS and somewhat trying to come to a international agreement around a mining code that will inform deep sea exploitation of mineral resources. So the issue was quite crucial in the sense that as state parties tried to progress the deep sea mining exploitation regulations, there was some push from like-minded states who see the importance of the ISA as this international body who is mandated to implement or oversee UNCLOS, to start having some discussions around the need for a general policy for protection and preservation of marine minerals or marine ecosystems. And this has come at the back. Many state parties are drawing the experiences from BBNJ and other conservation, marine conservation international instruments, best, or rather see how best we can inform the exploitation regulations or how the ISA could have a policy, a general policy on protection, because that is one of the mandates of the UNCLOS that the ISA oversees. So that was a really big push this year, apart from ongoing inputs from state parties, and this took place at this year's 30th session. I'll park the International Seabed Authority developments because there is still a lot of clauses of this exploitation regulation that is yet to be agreed. You have state parties like China who are really pushing to continue the progress of negotiations, but you have other clauses of this regulation that talks about underwater cultural heritage, the environmental regulations, and of course, the benefit sharing and how these regulations will inform the common heritage of all mankind, how we benefit. So this is still left in brackets, and we still far, and when I say we, meaning state parties of the ISA, who are far from coming to an agreement. So we still have a long way. The global community has a long way at the International Seabed Authority, but wanted to draw it back to the region. This year was quite important in the sense that the region had its first deep sea Talanoa, a regional political dialogue, which we really understand well that some of our countries sit on different sides of the table on this issue. You have countries who are sponsoring and who are progressing the agenda of deep sea mining, not only within their national jurisdiction, but also at the international arena. And we had the first convening. I think there's a lot of consent this year, given civil society and other key stakeholders were not invited to this space. But it's really important that we open up these spaces to discuss and consult far and wide around an issue that internationally there is still a lot of loopholes legally, but there's also a lot of uncertainty, and it's like a test progress in the sense of science. Science is still developing around this. So there's some caution there as we draw a regional political conversation into intersessionals. What we agree as a regional collective on this issue is also important, and it needs to be beyond just state parties and the so-called technical advices within these spaces. I think we need to draw from other international developments, be it BBNJ, the recent ICJ ruling, some of these international standing or precedent settings that are happening that needs to come back and inform our regional stance. This year also convened the region's first Pacific Ocean Ministers Conference that just happened at the back of the DSM Talanoa, and it's really, really important that such conversations that impact our oceans internationally are also brought to the table regionally. So there are no gaps in conversation and policy setting. This year we have 40, as we speak, we have 40 states who are pushing for a global moratorium. This is to acknowledge some of the political movements that happen in the Pacific, 8 of which are from the Pacific, and a sub-regional grouping, the MSG, still holds that political space or that movement around a moratorium. So we have 40 countries that are pushing for a moratorium, and we hope to see more countries join this political movement, and it will be interesting to see how they inform a general policy on deep sea mining within the ISA. Lastly, back to the ISA, and I think this is something that Maureen will pick up in her intervention, but I think this year was quite crucial. As Trump or the US administration continues to threaten other multilateral environmental agreements, the same is happening not only within the climate, but it is having an impact within the ISA. This year, on the 21st of April, the Trump administration signed an executive order, somewhat to unleash offshore critical minerals for the US. This really threatens multilateralism within the ISA. And countries at the ISA or member state parties at this year's 30th session really came hard on USA. This is to say that the US is not a party to UNCLOS, but state parties at this 30th session really called on US to not progress anything further. The US is now in bed with the metals company, one of the few companies that has really appeared prominently in this space and is advising the US around this executive order. But there are a number of implications, both environmental, but also the geopolitical implications, which Maureen may cover within the security conversations around this. But with this executive order, this ignores the UNCLOS and it gives the trigger of the freedom of the high seas. You could see the increase, this executive order could trigger an interest in industry and corporations and how they do bilateral agreements with other developed countries to pursue a critical minerals approach or to export, rather to trigger exploitation and ignore the UNCLOS. So this is a bad precedent setting by the US. We hope that the ISA, both Assembly and the Council, could hold ground and warn the US. It was interesting to see China talk about multilateralism and how we all, as global partners, need to contribute to maintaining unity within the UNCLOS space. I think this is a perfect segue to hand it over to Maureen, and we can come back to some of the developments for next year or in the coming years. Over to you, Maureen.
Thanks, Joey, and thanks to the panelists. I think it's a really good way to tie a couple of threads from the previous speakers. And I wanted to start by really focusing the discussions on security to traditional security, and in particular, the militarization of the oceans. What I'm calling the shadowy, so I'm going to borrow from India, the word shadowy elephants in the ocean space. But I think we're giving bad press to elephants, so maybe we should change that to the shadowy sharks in the ocean space. But that's what I want to focus on, and I want to use just 3 points kind of to illustrate the way the Pacific Ocean in particular is being hyper-militarized. I'm going to use Naima's word for the first point, really to help us understand the magnitude of how oceans is being militarized, the scale and scope of how much that's been militarized. And, you know, for us at Pang and Dawn, we've been looking at this, and we are seeing it extend from the subsoil, the sea floor of our deep ocean, 4,000 meters below, 5,000 meters below, through the water column, right up to the surface and into the airspace. That's how much of our ocean is actually being militarized. From within jurisdiction, so within our EEZs, all the way into the high seas, we are seeing these kinds of militarization in several ways. Firstly, as Joey has said, 2025 has made very, very clear that critical minerals, whether from land or from the deep ocean itself, have a military end use. And that's been made very clear in 2025. They're deemed extremely vital for defense, industrial base, enabling the production of military platforms, such as fighter aircrafts, tanks, missiles, submarines, ammunition, artillery shells, and nuclear warheads. But they're also critical for semiconductors and high-powered magnets used in next-generation advanced weapon systems, in artificial intelligence and advanced computing, which also have significant military application. So 2025 is the year where we see the link between critical minerals on the seafloor and use military. I think that's the first thing. In the water column, we are seeing two things. One is an expanded nuclear highway of submarines, both nuclear powered and nuclear armed, which are in part, this part of the world linked to AUKUS, which is the trilateral defense pact between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the US. Which is also triggering an increasing amount of unmanned underwater vehicles, including lethal autonomous weapon systems. Globally, and I think many of you would have seen the news today, 42 states have at least 485 military submarines. Of the 42, 6 have nuclear-powered submarines. AUKUS will make Australia the 7th. And today, the Trump administration has just approved South Korea to be the 8th country to build nuclear-powered submarine. So that's an escalation of nuclear submarines in the Pacific that we're going to see. Since AUKUS was signed in 2021, there have been at least publicly known 6 nuclear submarine port visits to Australia, including an Ohio-class submarine. And this one generally has nuclear weapons on them. Australia's official position operates on the basis of neither confirming nor denying the presence of nuclear weapons on these submarines. Attached to AUKUS is really this kind of the pillar 2, which is where these kinds of autonomous networks of vehicles are being tested. In October 2024, Indo-Pacific Command Center announced in a press statement that it had successfully completed pillar 2 of these tests. The event was part of, I think, this kinds of experiments that are taking place, very similar to the kind of nuclear tests. Experiments called the Autonomous Warrior 24. It was part of a larger maritime big play initiative. And really, this was really around trying to improve maritime awareness through network autonomy, decision advantage, enhanced strike. And attached to this, again, 2025, we've seen Australia announced that it was going to purchase, and I'll talk a little bit about this Shadow Shark unmanned stealth vehicles, submarine vehicles. Large sums of money are going to be spent of this. In the water column also, we're seeing, and this has implications for BB&J, we're seeing the weaponizing of biodiversity for defense purposes, including biological warfare or enhanced naval surveillance in war. If you want more material, I think Alma is just posting some of the recent research that Dawn and Pang has produced along this. And finally, on the surface of the ocean, really, we know that the Pacific holds or hosts the largest war games, unpack. The last one was in 2024. It involved 29 nations, 40 ships, 150 aircraft carriers, 25,000 military personnel. Again, that's the scale, the magnitude that we have to grapple with in terms of the militarization, the hyper-militarization of the ocean. But I think the other key thing that we have to really grapple with is that the military has these kinds of imaginaries that are quite expansive. And if you think about it, kind of the colonial imaginaries of military power in reconfiguring geography. We now have a very live Indo-Pacific geography space that is really, that captures vast amounts of oceans space, including the Indian Ocean, South China Seas, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Ocean, all in one. This is the critical reconfiguration of the theater that military kind of players operate in. This new imaginaries of geographies called the Indo-Pacific. How is this happening? How is this militarization taking place right underneath all of us, our noses, effectively? Really, I think I would suggest that it's really through security and defense agreements. I think one of the trends that we're certainly seeing in 2025 is that there are now already over 60 security and defense specs reported by The Guardian, crisscrossing around the entire Pacific Ocean. Where once trade agreements was the fashion, in which many movements was really resisting the kinds of overtures into sovereignty policy space, I would suggest that security agreements and arrangements are now the vogue in 2025, spurred in large part by AUKUS. This was the trigger that really kind of set the tone for the kinds of, it has one single purpose, and that's the strategic denial and containment of China footsteps. The thing that about the security and defense treaties that we're seeing right now is that they're capturing vast areas outside of traditional security. So they're capturing development cooperation, climate security through climate mobility, resilience, disaster relief, financing, strategic infrastructure, and policing are all being captured in these kinds of security and defense agreements that are crisscrossing the Pacific. Many of us will have our own pet favorites about which security agreement we want to discuss, but I think the one that I want to flag tonight is the most recent one that was announced at the defense ministers meeting that's taking place in Chile, which is really around the military disaster response group. Now, people would know that military soft power has been to kind of organize around provide disaster relief. We've seen it in Hunga Tonga, we've seen it in Cyclone Pam, several other tropical cyclones that have taken place. But this proposal that's just come out, hot off the press, really wants to move beyond the scope, its limited scope of disaster, to also conduct stabilization missions with the possibility of enabling legal frameworks. It has the buy-in of 3 Pacific Island countries, Fiji, PNG, and Tonga, and it's to work alongside Australia, New Zealand, France, and Japan in this reconstruction and this kind of mission creep of traditional security and military into disaster risk response. I think there's some glaring trouble forecasts that we have to think about in terms of international humanitarian law. Given the Pacific's position in relation to what's happening in Gaza and the way we've voted against international humanitarian law, I think it would be interesting to see how the legal frameworks develop and if there are lawyers on this particular call, it would be interesting to hear your views on how the Pacific, in terms of all of its contradictions, will deal with humanitarian law under stabilization missions in the Pacific. There's some serious questions that we have to consider around sovereignty. It seems like wholesale, we are selling sovereignty today. The stationing of foreign troops, access to infrastructure like deep water ports for dual purposes, such as military. And finally, my last point, and I'm going to completely overwhelm everybody right now. I think it's what's funding this. And I think, that's where I think what we're seeing is the investment, the shifts of money, because we are now moving into a context in 2025 where rearmament, war, nuclear war is becoming the clearest trend that we're seeing this year. Again, hot off the press, Trump has just announced that the US will resume nuclear testing after 30 years moratorium on nuclear arms testing. So we are now in a space where investment flows into rearmament is quite high. And just a couple of key figures here. If we just look at AUKUS, the total bill is $368 billion over 30 years. Australian taxpayers have paid up to $1 billion for US nuclear submarines. And under the recently signed critical minerals between the US and Australia, that's billed at $8.5 billion, of which Australia and US will invest more than $3 billion together. Australia's agreed to purchase $1.2 billion in underwater unmanned vehicles, $2.6 billion to take delivery of the first tranche of Apache helicopters. And it just keeps going on, the kinds of investment that is going to the industrial military complex. The key thing that really, when we're looking at investments, is really the wholesale capture of civilian institutions, including academia, our labor of our people, and our governance systems. I think one of the key trends that we're seeing here is that security kind of agreements are taking place at a regional level, which is what we saw in trade. and then gets forced down international level. And so it's undermining kinds of the roles of parliaments, democratic processes at the national level. So I think that's me. But I want to just wrap this session and kind of take us a little bit into where do we go from here, given the dire state of oceans. And I think if I was listening correctly, Naima and Oliver have already kind of kickstarted, and I think India, in fact, everybody has already kickstarted. Where do we go from here? Naima talked a little bit about where do we go? Well, governments, how do governments really move the agenda, particularly the special procedures, communications, and official statement to make that a little bit, how do we bring that into reality in terms of our Pacific government states in relation to Fukushima? And BB&J, I think all of you've just been really quite a lot that you've forecasted in terms of priorities around implementation, capacity, equity and inclusion, connection and coherence. But I wonder whether there is something that we should discuss around cultural, indigenous knowledge, cultural relationships, partnerships that are not transactional, particularly because security is hyper-transactional. So maybe something for Oliver, India, even Joey, to think about when you're thinking about your responses, because it is. And particularly, how do you build strong institutional structures when the US is hell-bent on undermining multilateralism and breaking institutional structure? So maybe it really just to really push us in our thinking. But maybe, Joey, you're going to be first up. Where do we go from here with the ISA? Because it's likely that the US will ignore, unilaterally go ahead and appropriate minerals with implicating two Pacific Island nations. Where do movements and Pacific Island states need to go from here? Over to you, Joey.
Wow, what a way to wrap up our first segment, Maureen. And I think it sits really perfectly in the sense that while some of the and before I jump into the ISA, what do we do at the back or in the context of increasing hyper-militarized region, but also the global context where state parties like the US is threatening other multilateral agreement spaces. What needs to come out and how do we respond to that? But I think your wrap up of this session is quite important in the sense that it really right across, regardless of you be in BBNJ, you're ensuring the engagement of indigenous people, or be it Fukushima. I think it really calls for especially for us as Pacific people, and most of our political spaces like to refer as to us as this big blue Pacific, and it normally informs our policy spaces, how we turn up the spaces. But I think it's important for us, especially in this region, and it will require in the coming months, if superpowers are not able to push a security deal or agree to something, threat is now they're going bilaterally with some of our state parties. And I think for us in the region, it requires another level of vigilance. How do we be more vigilant as movements, as civil society partners, as grassroots movements, but also religious institutions? But it also requires a certain level of vigilance from some of our technical institutions who are providing technical advisory to our political spaces and how we turn up at the international space. So I think it requires that level of vigilance either in the coming years. I think it's quite crucial, like I made mention, as to where to from now. This year is quite crucial in the sense that we're halfway in a decade of ocean and science. We're halfway that really needs to take a stock of the health of our ocean And that's a right across. It's not looking back on just how we progress deep sea mining, but how we turn up in BBNJ, how we turn up at the CBD, but also how do we address issues around the impacts of fisheries agreements on small-scale fishers. So to take on your questions, I think for the deep sea mining, it's going to be quite crucial as to how US, who is not a state party, this could create a ripple effect on other state parties and how they take on state investor partnerships outside within national jurisdiction. So it's going to start appearing, and it's already appearing within some of our sponsoring states who are pursuing or who are somewhat portraying that they're interested in exploring deep sea science, but also deep sea exploration, or to some extent, exploitation. And I think for us as Pacific people, we need to start pushing the boundaries. We need to start having legal safeguards in place. What does it mean if one of our members in our Pacific decides to say, we're not getting any progress at the ISA, we should go and start exploitation within our national jurisdiction? What does it mean as specific state parties, and what are the implications? So I think one of the important things to push forward next year or in the coming months is start to have these legal discussions. What are the legal gaps? What are the legal safeguards for those that are pushing moratorium? And I think it's important that for state parties who are calling for a protection or some pause, what does it really mean in terms of from national to regional, and how does it inform a global moratorium, or how do we inform a global pause? So this is some very important things that, especially within the deep sea mining, I think our biggest call now is some legal safeguards, but also to draw from some of the progressive multilateral agreements. Where are the safeguards within BBNJ? Where is the safeguard within some of the eat loss rulings? And I think as we progress around, especially within the ISA circles, is we're going to increasingly see countries seek eat loss or legal opinions to set precedents. So that's something I, as someone who engages in that space, predict. But we need to stop seeing, and I say this with more emphasis, we need to stop seeing things as I'm engaged in BBNJ, so this is where my jurisdiction ends with biodiversity. I engage on WTO, so I'm just going to be specific on fish and fishing. Fukushima, so I'm just going to look at where Japan's boundaries around nuclear pollution is. I think we need to start approaching things collectively and see where the lower hanging fruits and what needs to be brought up to better, higher standards. But I think with US triggering a lot of executive orders and threatening a lot of multilateral agreements in the environmental space and the ocean space, we could see the international governance starting to shift. And where it takes us would be interesting, but we have to ensure that we take our people. It is our indigenous peoples and our indigenous communities that need to inform our resistance. I think I'll leave it at that, and maybe I'll hand it over to Olive. I hope I got the flow right. I'll hand it over to Olive very quickly because it's very important, you touched on some of the key things, especially come the implementation, the need for engagement. But we have 60 states, and I'd be really interested to know, what is the Pacific's big push and who from the Pacific are pushing certain aspects of these implementations, and what can we expect especially from the Pacific, when the first COP meets?
Thank you, Joey. And I'll try. I'm trying to see if I'll answer all of those. Just writing those down. So for the Pacific right now, I mentioned the first COP. It hasn't been decided when exactly it will take place, but it's definitely a celebration on the BB&J side that we've reached 60 ratifications, and it's and it's entering into force in January next year. So that's on the entry to force bit. Sorry, Joey, I think I missed the other two, but I just wanted to quickly touch on what Maureen mentioned. She mentioned about Indigenous knowledge holders. So the High Seas Alliance, our part in Indigenous knowledge holders, like for BB&J, we're trying to center it through our HSA IPNLC engagement strategy. So this is like an internal thing because it works across 60 plus of our members. So at the heart of it, we want to ensure that our members, there's co-creation and co-design in the work going forward for BB&J, because too many times, we've seen like it's more like a ticking of the box exercise. But like I mentioned before about us needing to shape the process, this is a shift to that. So it's not just consultation, but trying to ensure that they're also part of the like decision-making process as well. So that's how we're doing BB&J work for our organization. But I'm also mindful that there's also organizations on here, as well as regional partners that are already doing a lot of this work on the ground. So yeah, we're hoping to engage with them further going forward with BB&J implementation for the region. I think I may have missed some of your questions, Joey, if you want to repeat them or go back, but I'm sorry, I missed some.
No, you good, Olive, and maybe we can come back to it. Just wanted to, what are maybe some of the key things that the region, and I understand we've had, and this is some of our regional institutions holding regional consultations on some of the BB&J implementation regionally and nationally. But for us as a region moving forward into our first COP, what are some of our key takes as a region that some of our political blocks would be taking? And maybe you can come back to that, but maybe to just jump quickly to Naima, and sorry to put you on the spot, Naima, but around the communication with the sixth human rights special rapporteur, and we understand that's with Japan right now, and Japan has the right to respond. But maybe for us in the region, politically, what is expected for us from the region, not only just civil society, but um, that need for political action at the back of acknowledging that we have established regional treaties such as the Rarotonga Treaty, and how can we best elevate that? I'm just thinking around some of the safeguarding measures for us in the region, and one is the Rarotonga Treaty as we speak.
Mhm.
Over to you, Naima.
Yeah, I think that that's a key question, and I do want to start off by saying, am I off mute? Yes, okay. I appreciate what you said, Joey, about the need for integration. I think the key for 2026, with all of these moving components, will be integration and rejecting siloed approaches and ensuring that ocean protection is co-designed, as Oliver said, and co-led by local and indigenous communities, because we really can't afford to treat governance, climate, biodiversity, security as separate agendas. We in the Pacific know and appreciate the importance of a holistic approach. So I think this is the time to celebrate that. And with respect to Fukushima, I think what stands out as priorities, the first thing that comes to mind is our sovereignty and our ownership over ocean data and evidence. And second, our collective legal authority under existing regional and international instruments, especially the Treaty of Rarotonga and the recent UN Human Rights Council communication on the Fukushima discharges. So as you said, this is an existing instrument, and we should be in a position to leverage that. These discharges have revealed a structural problem in how, science is used in decisions that affect our region. So Japan and the I won't give the acronym. I'll just it's there's so many acronyms. The International Atomic Energy Agency, they rely on data and modeling frameworks that Pacific states have very little ability to independently verify. Yet somehow we're expected to rely on those same data sets to judge what is safe for our health, for our marine ecosystems and our cultures. And I see there being a beautiful confluence and opportunity for nuclear waste issues in the Pacific, to be at least in part addressed by the BB&J, as Olive has identified, because part of the mandate there is to establish data standards and to use data science techniques for environmental impact assessments, right? And scientific research within the framework of this treaty. So here's an opportunity where the Pacific can really advocate for its need to be able to verify that science, because legally not being able to verify the science undermines both, and bear with me, I'm just going to be a little bit nerdy with the law, but it undermines both the right to information and the right to science. And these are both rights protected under international law, under the ICCPR specifically, and the ICE-SCR. So it leaves Pacific governments unable to meet their own duties as well under UNCLOS, Articles 192 and 194, which require states to protect and to preserve the marine environment and to prevent transboundary pollution. So if we are serious about the health of our ocean, we must have control over the data and the methodologies used to assess the environmental harm. And I don't think that necessarily means creating new institutions. We don't need to start from scratch because we've done so much work to have treaties like the Treaty of Rarotonga, but it means strengthening coordination among existing Pacific scientific bodies, and ensuring that Pacific institutions and not external actors hold and interpret the evidence that informs our legal and policy responses. So in my opinion, the Treaty of Rarotonga, which was entered into force in 1986, gives us a clear legal foundation for this. And one distinctive feature of the treaty, one often overlooked, is its explicit commitment to keeping our region free from radioactive pollution. So again, with the legalese, Article 7 in particular obliges states parties not to dump radioactive wastes or other radioactive matter at sea anywhere within the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone, and to prevent such dumping by anyone in their own territorial sea. So that's really important because it's saying it's not only a prohibition, but a positive duty. And it requires states to actively ensure that no one introduces radioactive matter into the Pacific's waters. So when we interpret this in light of modern environmental law and the precautionary principle, Article 7 can be read as extending to any intentional release of radioactive matter into the Pacific Ocean, no matter where it originates, if it threatens the environmental integrity of the zone. And there's already a mechanism to advance this, because within that same treaty, Article 10 allows the consultative committee to consider questions of implementation and interpretation. So in 2026, I think Pacific states could really use that mechanism to clarify the scope of Article 7 and to articulate a regional legal position reaffirming, and we're very good at doing, we have to get used to reaffirming the Pacific's nuclear-free status against all forms of radioactive discharge. So now the recent joint communication by the UN Special Rapporteurs to Japan provides a critical bridge for this work. because the experts concluded that the ALPS system cannot remove all radioactive contaminants, and they warned of possible violations of those human rights, not just in Japan, but across the Pacific. And I think the next step is to build on that communication. So there are three kind of steps that come to mind. Pacific states could, one, they could formally respond through coordinated submissions, reaffirming Pacific concerns and calling for a halt to further discharges pending independent verification, which I believe has already been done. They can also, the second point is to reference the communication within the Rarotonga Treaty Framework and strengthen that legal link between human rights obligations and environmental protection under Article 7. And the third point is that Pacific states could integrate human rights-based monitoring into regional environmental governance and ensure that future assessments of pollution or radioactive risk also account for cultural rights or food security and indigenous knowledge systems. So in short, what comes next is about closing that accountability loop. We now have international human rights findings and we have the regional legal instruments. The task now is to translate those into enforceable regional standards grounded in the law of this region, which is sourced by us and backed by science and Pacific authority. Because I don't think the health of our ocean will be secured by external assurances. It'll be assured by I think it'll be secured when Pacific states define and verify and enforce what protection means using our own data and our own legal instruments. So I think that might be a good segue to I'd say Maureen, because I think you've touched a lot on preventing the expansion of weaponization and military spending. So I'd love to pass it on to you, if that's right, Joey.
Thank you. I think, yes, it's a brilliant segue. And I think perhaps to really relook at the Rarotonga Treaty and a lot of movements right now are preoccupied with the current Ocean of Peace concept. But in my view, the Rarotonga Treaty is probably our best instrument that we can really enhance what Joe is talking about, really kind of build the safeguards of this one to expand. I mean, what I said about militarization is quite extensive, and I think we need to capture that in a refreshed Rarotonga Treaty to really look at the kinds of threats that militarization is posing to the region through the Rarotonga Treaty. And it's already there. 2026 is a very critical year. It's obviously being reviewed. And I think this really just gives movements a great chance to kind of reshape what this one instrument, which is to make it, in addition to its strong anti-nuclear positioning in terms of kind of transport, production, but it really anti-militarization, to embed that in the Rarotonga Treaty, because the region is really highly insecure right now by virtue of the kinds of traditional security shenanigans that's taking place. So I think that's an opportunity that can rally, that can build on what we have. There's precedents. The Antarctica Treaty is probably the only other instrument externally that has dealt with militarization. So I think we can look at other regions of the world where beyond just nuclear, to really start taking on the question of demilitarization in the context of rearmament and expansionist agenda of the military. I think Rarotonga Treaty is a good landing point that can bring legal, political movements, historical movements that have shaped, that have a far bigger vision for our region than many of our countries, and in particular countries like Fiji that have militaries. I mean, I think we've got to really take this on rather than be distracted by the ocean of peace concept that our leaders are looking to implement. I think 2026 is a good point for us to rally and expand the anti-nuclear to include an anti-militarization and make this a truly ocean of peace kind of instrument. So I think that's one landing point, and I think you would know this, Naima, more than many of us, because I'm not a lawyer. But I think if we look at building kinds of regional instruments in terms of legal norms to help shape global or international norms, is also another way for us to look at that. So we can, of course, look at human rights instruments, building that into what we have existing at national level, but also what can the region offer globally in terms of setting and establishing higher standards, legal safeguards, as Joey points out. I think this is something that we can do and do effectively through the Rarotonga Treaty in 2026. So I'm really excited by that opportunity that can bring our best legal minds, our best movements, historical movements. We've got quite a lot of material that I think we can work with, really to bring to kind of shape, because I think we need to give back to the international community around this wider notions of peace. And I think that's, for me, would be my way of saying that. And then I think it would be good to pass on to, I think we're running out of time, Joey. I'm looking at you now.
No, I mean, thank you, Naima, for, going back to use, or rather speak power to the Rarotonga Treaty and how it can work as a legal safeguard for the increasing nuclear threats, and what Maureen spoke to about the nuclear highway. I think just a quick jump over to India, and I think it's important, as drawing back to what I had just said around deep sea mining and how it took form and shape through the similar pathway as some of us and actors around this space are seeing. What's crucial in the coming years, as parties gather to inform national policies around blue carbon, even communities engaging at the forefronts around blue carbon. And how is this happening in absence of legal policies or policy safeguards? The terrestrial trade, blue carbon trade-offs that happened within some parts of Melanesia have set bad precedents. For us, this is a new frontier, or rather a reoccurring frontier now called the blue carbon. What is the caution moving forward when some of these things are happening in absence of legal clarity? The science and the calculation around most of these agreements, and the risk that some of the maritime provinces or communities are engaged with the stockbrokers or middleman stockbrokers. Over to you, India.
Thank you, Joey. I know carbon markets and the threats of carbon markets aren't as, I guess, tangible as some of our militarization examples and the nuclear waste examples, but I'm going to try and draw a bit of a thread here between what Maureen's talked about in terms of the influence of the US and Indigenous knowledge and what we kind of need to watch out for. I do just want to quickly point out that the idea of carbon markets came from the US, came from economists and physicists in the US. And it was a right-wing think tank that then lobbied the Republican Party to then make sure it got into the Kyoto Protocol so as to make a win for the American government in terms of setting the pathway in climate action in a direction for business volunteerism or kind of free market principles through climate action. And so we're seeing that play out now, right? Carbon markets have not delivered emissions reduction. In fact, they won't, right? The science just doesn't back it up. And we know from an Indigenous knowledge perspective that our ecosystems are not equations where the negative impacts of humans can be magicked away by some other good things elsewhere, that these are highly refined examples of balance. And I really want to draw on some, knowledge that I was raised with, but I know is present in other forms of Indigenous governance around the Pacific, which is that our governance has to mirror how nature governs itself, because nature's been doing this for tens of thousands, millions of years. And I would not consider carbon markets an equation approach to emissions to be something that mirrors nature. Instead, you just stop doing the negative impact. It's as simple as that. And we've seen the policy impacts of the expansion and the growth of carbon markets in that it has altered how much policy space there is for meaningful keep fossil fuels in the ground, which is really what we have to return to. And the carbon markets conversation and the expansion into including our marine ecosystems in that just continues to take away from the ambition around keeping fossil fuels in the ground. The other thing it takes us away from is meaningful justice-based reparations, climate reparations, and non-debt-based, non-debt exacerbating climate finance. And it's really hard. I know my colleagues in the climate space are feeling despondent about being able to achieve actually the global north having to pay up for its harms, but we have to keep recommitting to that. I want to draw on what was talked about by Naima in terms of, the Pacific leadership in this space. We've got to see that this year with the outcome from the ICJ and the opinion on climate responsibility. And it found that governments do have an international law responsibility, a human rights obligation to reduce emissions at the source, not just keep buying their way out. And I think that's something to consider over the next few years as countries like Vanuatu and Fiji continue to develop their carbon market policies, is whether it continues to be in alignment with the Pacific morality that we're so proud of and the Indigenous commitment to justice that we're so proud of, that we then create carbon commodities that help polluters buy their way out of their obligations. And Australia is a major buyer of the credits that are produced from the Pacific for covering up of mines and fossil fuel extraction in Australia. And we have to think about our Indigenous brothers and sisters in Australia who are then bearing the brunt of these fossil fuel activities. And even in Aotearoa, we've heard some of our main centrist environmental commissioners come out and say, hang on, forest offsets has gone way off path and has actually not worked in the emissions trading scheme in Aotearoa and has continued to push the expansion of exotic pine forestries that have done a lot of damage to our communities and to our soil. So I think that's the thing is next year, wherever you live, keep an eye on what the carbon policy is. I know it's not the sexiest topic. I know it's not the most interesting topic, but we have to track it. We have to keep an eye on it because these are the spaces in which those global corporations, those who want to turn our trees into a tradable commodity, are seeking to maintain that status quo and that business world order. When we know in Indigenous economics, you turn something into a commodity, it means that we don't all have access to it, right? We know in terms of health, housing, education, you turn it into something that can be possessed as property, means someone else can't have access to it, and you create an exploitative relationship. And they're all about sharing, at least where I come from, is making sure that everyone is taken care of equitably. And I think we need to uphold that. And particularly for those of us who had connections and influence into academic spaces and policy development spaces in wealthier countries like in Australia and New Zealand, we have to hold that line as well, because carbon markets are the new, but actually old, flash new kid on the block. And also some of our academic groups, our think tanks, our NGOs need to be held accountable and told, actually, no, this isn't the pathway to go down. There might be good intentions, but it's actually not going to play out the way we hope it to. And I know West Papua has been mentioned in the chat as well. And I do want to draw special mention to, Indonesia is very interested in the expansion of blue carbon, particularly for their mangroves. And a lot of those mangroves are in West Papua, and so there are major human rights implications when it comes to carbon trading. When the human rights monitoring systems even set up internationally under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement are nowhere near up to scratch when it comes to preventing those kinds of breaches before they even happen, and having that impact of dispossession of territory from Indigenous communities who are currently under colonial occupation. So yeah, keep an eye on what your government's doing. keep passionate about carbon markets, even if it's not, and stay talking to your colleagues about these kind of things. And if you need extra data and support, we've got our blue carbon report that we wrote and published earlier this year. I know the link's been dropped in the chat, but I'm sure Alma will release it again. And I think, yeah, that recommitment to the justice of this situation, and the commitment to decent, meaningful, grant-based climate finance. Yeah, that's it. Thank you, Joey.
Thank you, India. I'm just conscious of time. Sorry, Adam. This is so usual of me to automatically go into moderator mode. So just very cautious of time. We still have 39 committed participants who are eager to engage, and I'll leave maybe just 10 to 15 minutes if there's any questions. I see Maureen has been busy in the Q&A chat box, ranging from DSM, which we've covered, the Oceans of Peace as a declaration that leaders have recently passed, one on independent ocean science. That's an important topic for itself, how much of independent ocean science national countries are doing, but also the region where we are. So these are some of the developments, and thank you very much, Peep, Philippa Laurie, for joining us. I've seen Maureen has just responded, RMI being one, but yeah, we'll open it up now if you have any questions for our esteemed panelist. And a perfect one from Lavinia Dake, who is asking, where can we take these learnings and socialize that it could be understood around communities? Apart from the collective here of High Seas Alliance, from Olive, from Ocean Vision Legal, Naima, from Dawn, Maureen, and here from us, Peng, there are other collectives we're happy to provide some resources. If you look into the resource, rather the chat box, there's a number of resource materials, but we hope to have these ongoing conversations. But we'll open it up now for question and answer. Unfortunately, time is really catching up on us. Conscious that one of our participants is joining us all the way from the UK, and it's almost 8:30 in this part of the world. So we'll open it up. Questions, participants, if you have any questions, if you'd like to pose a question, a burning question, nothing that you think we have not covered. But this has been an interesting conversation, and one that I hope we've done justice to the state of the ocean, but this is just scratching surface level, and I'm sure more conversations of this can provide more deeper understandings. But yeah, we'll keep it open if you have any questions, any burning questions. There's a question from Susanna. Has anyone considered the consequences of the US supporting the creation of a virtual country in the Marshallese space so that it can maintain control of the EEZ in the rise of Russia? That's a little bit of geopolitics there, but I'm not knowledgeable of this. Maureen, would you like to tackle that?
I mean, only
Yeah.
because Tuvalu is, to my knowledge, the only country that has publicly announced that it's venturing into this territory of creating a digital nation. And I think I wasn't aware that the Marshall Islands was also considering this option. But I think, the crucial factor that needs to be considered is where that initiative originates from. So is it coming from the country itself, and why, and what are the implications, and how is that how are the logistics being coordinated and facilitated in a way that empowers and is conducive to the country's self-determination efforts and sovereignty? And if it's not conducive, then I see it as quite problematic. So, you know, I think the consequences are they depend on where this initiative is originating from and the reasons for it. I think I'd need a little more information, but it might be a helpful starting point to explore what Tuvalu has done to digitize its administrative uh, government and kind of upload different aspects of even cultural knowledge to the metaverse. It's quite fascinating and daunting at the same time.
Thank you, Naima. Do we have any more questions before I just give it to my co-moderators to do a quick wrap? If there's any quick summary points? I see no hands from our participants or attendees for tonight, so I'll maybe very quickly allow my co-panelists to give a quick summary on points that they have not touched in regards to tonight's two key questions, but also things that they think may be important to reflect on the state of our oceans in 2025. Over to you, Adam.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for those questions. Maybe the only thing I'll add is this sort of pulls on the threads from the previous discussion around the need for Pacific countries to consider really risky economic endeavors. So we have things like blue carbon. We have the debt work. Countries taking on debt for in response to natural disasters and other reasons. Considering security treaties that are now becoming development treaties, and even within those conversations around who can and cannot then provide infrastructure support to countries that critically need infrastructure. So this foundational economic question sits behind a lot of these, I think, issues, and I think that's something that Peng has worked on that for quite a while. It's through the trade sphere and now the debt sphere. And I think that's something that we also need to keep an eye on and match with these other discussions around, and increasingly how that's becoming militarized and securitized. So yeah, sorry, that's not a very positive thing to say, but that's the reality of the world we're living in, and what Pacific Island countries are facing. And yeah, so maybe I can leave that open to whoever wants to jump in next.
Olive, maybe we go with Olive.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Joey. So I just quickly wanted to touch on what comes next in the steps to follow for the first BBNJ COP. There are PrepCom BBNJ meetings. So these meetings are crucial in shaping how the treaty will operate, and it ensures it delivers on its promise to protect the 2/3 of the oceans. So we had one in August, but the next one is upcoming, which is in April, May next year. And like one of the key things that Joey also asked me was like the major political blocs or the groupings. And I just wanted to acknowledge here the PSIDs, the Pacific SIDs. They are crucial. They are the negotiators of the region, and they work very hard to advance a unified Pacific voice. And they do so by reflecting this across the negotiations in coordination with the larger groups like G77 in China and AOSIS. AOSIS is also one of the key ones that they focus on SID-specific needs. Particularly of interest to the Pacific is simplified access to financing, as well as the capacity building and tech transfer framework. Another key thing I wanted to just raise with the audience going forward is that there should be, the agreement has entered into force, but we should not stop there. We should push for ratification of countries to ratify the BBNJ, so that we ensure that the BBNJ agreement rules apply across the global ocean. And my last point is that this we've heard from all the panelists on the different key issues. And I think this is an opportunity for us to further strengthen the linkages that we have. So it's not only our job, but we should also bring in like other stakeholders, youth groups, academic partners that was raised by one of the partners to build on the advocacy of not just the issues that you specialize in, but across the region. So in closing, I just wanted to end with like a Samoan proverb where it's called "E so'o le fau I le fau." So connecting fiber with fiber, like our strength is in our unity. And currently, like we have a lot of issues, but we're also a big collective. And like the attendees on here are just a fraction of who's working in the ocean space. And if we work collectively, then we definitely have hope. So thank you.
Thank you for leaving us with that beautiful Samoan proverb that speaks to solidarity. And I see Jivette just raised a question about our level of intelligence in the region, but it also speaks to our strength in solidarity. We can be very smart, but we sometimes tend to go um, individually, but we are solid together. And I think Olive made really good reference to a bloc that continues to support and inform the Pacific's engagement at the UN on the issue of BBNJ. Very quickly, I'll give it to Maureen and Naima, and then we could, India, if you have any last few comments, nothing from India. Naima, you have anything to add?
Well, I just want to acknowledge that I think it's let me articulate. It's true that the hope in ocean protection can feel quite scarce because progress is slow and the threats are accelerating, as we've heard. But I've also seen how real change happens when local action and international advocacy work hand in hand. And I'm cognizant that much of our audience have been, Pacifica peoples and from the Pacific region. And so, I think for Pacific Islanders in particular, whether you are working in policy or community or a student, I think it's crucial to remember that you have an inherent right to be a part of these conversations, not as outsiders, but as knowledge holders and traditional custodians of the ocean. And our voices have always belonged here. And for everyone else, remembering that this isn't just a Pacific issue, but that the ocean connects and sustains all life. Remembering that will enable us to move forward with a unified vision, the unified vision that we so desperately need. So protecting it is a shared responsibility. So nothing further from me, but I just thank you for this space. I've learned so much, and I look forward to continuing this conversation and this reflection on how we can move forward from 2025.
Thanks, Olive. Maureen, any last reflections for these, not only our panelists, but also those joining us?
I promise not to scare anybody anymore. Simply to say, I think really the partners hosting this event should make this an annual event. I think it's very, very critical because this is the first time that we are actually in practice of really bringing all the different issues together. So I think that's quite exciting moving forward. I think Naima's point about we have to break the silos quite deliberately do that. Otherwise, next year we'll find ourselves in our little tunnel spaces that we operate in and quite consistently. And in saying that, I think this should be a kind of flagship that I think civil society movement should carry into the new year. I think that's a very, very, I think this is just a starter, as Joey says. So I think that's good. One, I think the rally points that I think for 2026 are quite clear. I think Olive's point about the first BB&J meeting is quite critical. That's one rally point that we can bring kind of bridge some of the key things that we've flagged tonight. I think the Rarotonga Treaty is a second rally point that we can come together again in this kind of messy way. I think that's quite important that that we keep the tracks across always and quite deliberately. I think that will be quite a useful thing if going forward. I think that will be quite useful. That way it'll help us to feel less stressed about the things that we have to do, and particularly in the traditional security space. It's quite scary. I think that one will maybe need some, but I think Rarotonga Treaty is our best bet that we can rally around on that. And I think the ISA, 3 key things for 2026. I think we've got some big work that we can carry, but like everybody else, I'm quite hopeful about where we can go. And I really like Adam's forward direction, really to start scrutinizing and being diligent about the kind of overlapping security defense pack that's really tying up the region policy space and the questions of sovereignty. That's me. Thanks, Joey.
Thanks, Maureen. And I think just to very quickly wrap up, for me, I think it's really going back to review what are our legal safeguards, not only regionally, internationally, but for us nationally, yeah? Because most of the developments are happening bilaterally. Maureen obviously provides the reality of how geopolitics is informing ocean governance, not internationally, but within our region, and what we should be prepared. I'll still reemphasize on the need for the new type of vigilance that the region needs. And this is not just for our political actors, but also for movements. Movements will always be crucial, but I think it needs a revamp. How we start looking right across all sectors and not just operating in silos. Uh, Maybe to wrap, I just wanted to respond or maybe to pull from the question from Philippa Laurie around independent science. And I think there is a need for it, acknowledging the need for science to inform policy, but independent science. But to really reemphasize the need or the employment of the precautionary principle, something that I could have made mention this evening as another legal safeguard. When the region, there is lack of scientific evidence or advisory within the region, be it on BBNJ or Fukushima or on blue carbon or even on security, apply precautionary principles, and that could be our first and foremost legal safeguard. Anyway, to end this evening off, I really want to thank the remaining 33, but for being with us and your 7 core moderators. Thank you for remaining being on this webinar, taking this deep dive. But we appreciate our core panelists who have provided us a lot of hope and forward thinking next year. Next year remains a challenging year. With that, Tangi Tomas, Fafetai, Foexia, Vinaka, thank you so much wherever you're joining us from. And it's goodbye from OVL, Pang, Dawn, and High Seas Alliance.